今天我们国家是缺乏健康金融系统的风险。
Jack Ma had billions at stake from an impending world-beating Ant Group IPO. And yet, the Alibaba founder cast caution to the side and went straight for the throat.
今天的银行延续的还是当铺思想。
With government officials in the audience, Ma dared to criticize the very Chinese regulatory ecosystem that's allowed his tech empire's largesse, excoriating what he said is an antiquated financial system rife with risk-adverse lending and bad oversight. And within days, Chinese authorities torpedoed the joint mega listing in Hong Kong and Shanghai.
Chinese authorities have abruptly halted Ant Group's mega IPO.
This is really a stunning turn of events.
And unveiled new antitrust regulations that led to a multi-billion-dollar fine for Alibaba and a drastic overhaul of its fintech powerhouse Ant. It's unlikely the speech alone caused such a regulatory reprisal, but it was perhaps ill-advised to be so frank, with the IPO's $35 billion waiting in the wings. Talk about misreading the room.
Final straw, tip of the iceberg, it really backfired.
I think it is a watershed moment for regulating big tech in China.
Jack Ma, always a bit brash.
I never worry about the regulations. Why not? Because I know I'm a good boy.
We always step ahead of the regulators. We have to. Otherwise, we go nowhere.
He at last crossed not only the proverbial, but a new, real red line. Hello and welcome to this Bloomberg Television special, Red Lines, China and Big Tech. I'm Stephen Engel, here at the heart of China's big tech ambitions, Shenzhen behind me and the surrounding Greater Bay region. There's no doubt China's big tech platforms like Alibaba and Tencent are national champions. But as we've seen in the United States with its own big tech companies, there's growing concern that unchecked big tech is perhaps growing too pervasive, too powerful, and therefore too ungovernable. The Chinese government is sending a clear message to its biggest tech platforms. Anti-competitive and financially risky behavior will have consequences. Fresh off slapping Alibaba with a record $2.8 billion fine and announcing Ant Group would be significantly revamped, Chinese regulators warned 34 other internet companies, including Tencent, ByteDance, Baidu, Meituan, Pinduoduo, and JD.com, that they too must rectify their anti-competitive practices, such as, in Alibaba's case, forcing merchants to choose its e-commerce platforms over competitors. Alibaba actually thanked the government for its oversight and promised to comply and move on. Regulators urged the other firms to heed Alibaba's example.
We have experienced the scrutiny, and we're happy to get the matter behind us.
The good news is for Alibaba, the overhang is now removed. So the management, which is, in our view, very tested, very experienced, now can go back to their normal business.
Like Washington, Beijing has a love-hate relationship with their tech companies, right? On the one hand, these companies represent China's successful modernization. They kind of represent China's growing global competitiveness. And, Beijing can't afford to chop its champions off at the knees. But on the other hand, Beijing has kind of long struggled with how to fit big tech into the socialist market economy.
For sure, the punishment could have been much worse. After all, Alibaba wasn't broken up. It received a one-time, albeit pricey, slap on the wrist, equal to 4% of 2019 domestic revenue, along with a long to-do list to change its anti-competitive ways.
Once a monopoly is formed, it is very hard to reverse it. If you look at what the EU have done, they slashed Google's with almost $8 billion of fine. But, it hasn't really changed the competitive dynamic in the EU market. It hasn't really facilitated new entry.
But the anti-monopoly crackdown is only part of this story. Regulators also want to combat systemic risks from flourishing but under-regulated consumer lending via fintech juggernauts like Ant Group from Alibaba and WeBank from Tencent. Regulators will require Ant to become a financial holding company, effectively to be supervised with the same lending and capital restrictions as a bank, not as a more freewheeling fintech. In China, there's essentially a super app duopoly, Alibaba/Ant, Tencent/WeChat, where Fin meets tech in a big way in the cloud, combining shopping, lending, food delivery, insurance, music, and video, you name it, in convenient one-stop mobile ecosystems.
These services are linked by their respective payments platforms, Ant's Alipay and Tencent's Tenpay and WeChat Pay, which together handle nearly 95% of all online purchases in China. Alipay alone claims to have more than 1 billion users, processing more than $17 trillion in transactions a year. Regulators are demanding a more level playing field.
We all know digital finance has made a revolutionary change in China, especially in the areas of financial inclusion. But I think we all would agree that financial transactions should be regulated the same way as all other financial transactions.
While payments contribute about a third of Ant's revenue, its biggest moneymaker is through credit platforms like Huabei, which means just spend, and Jiebei, or just lend, that funnel loans from banks to millions of consumers across Alibaba's many platforms. But Ant funds only 2% of those loans, with the rest underwritten and securitized by the banking partners that want to leverage Ant's massive reach. And that means most of the risk falls to the banks, many of which are state-owned.
Whenever risk is being passed on to the banks, which means that you pass down to the depositors, and in China's case, there's almost an implicit sovereign guarantee of the banking sector. That's a cost that the state almost need to be absorbing.
Authorities will now require Ant to cut off any improper linking of payments with other financial products, including lending, its biggest moneymaker.
Essentially, the tech companies have been arguing that they are different than banks, but they have been behaving like banks, and Chinese regulators are coming in and going, no, you're behaving like banks online, therefore you're going to be regulated like banks offline.
And financial groups, forward restructuring definitely is something that we need to monitor for any potential rating impact on Alibaba.
They got too big for their boots. They had so much money invested. They became competitors to, I think, state banks in China, and were critical of the regulators. This was regarded as lèse-majesté by the Chinese regime, which doesn't want any criticism from anyone.
The call for tightened oversight comes from the very top, with President Xi Jinping warning that Beijing will continue to go after so-called platform companies that have amassed too much data and market power. Bending the knee may be the key to survival. When Tencent found itself possibly in the regulatory crosshairs, management was quick to reassure investors that compliance is our lifeline. All of China's big tech tycoons are now on notice.
I mean, this is the whole ace card of Xi Jinping, right? Is the superior form of governance, this message that the government has changed. So there is this, there is a script really that you can no longer just bash government.
The underlying policy tensions have been there for a really long time. So a lot of tensions have been building up in the past 10 years. It just, until this really small event that the whole balance was tipped.
Coming up, we'll explore just how Alibaba and Tencent have grown so large, and how the new regulations could have a big impact on future big tech M&A in China.
A lot of banks don't like us in China. We're not necessarily interested in buying the banks to change it, but because of us chasing them around, they reform. I do everything to promoting the business in China, promoting the business for SME around the world. And the government loves me because, I am helping them to create a business. What is Alibaba.com or Yahoo China? What's it going to be 5 years from now? For Alibaba Group, in the 5 years will be like today, put Google plus eBay in China. In the US, you see who do you come to? Amazon, Yahoo, Google, whatever. In China, there's only one. You. Alibaba, not me.
Welcome back to this Bloomberg Television special, Red Lines, China and Big Tech. I'm Stephen Engel. The Chinese economy was a much smaller beast when we sat down with Jack Ma a decade and a half ago in 2005. It was a pivotal year of financial transformation in China as the big state-owned banks were being restructured ahead of their mega listings the following year. Things in China were about to get very interesting.
The government in China had the vision. They understood Chinese people are not dumb. They are creative. They are entrepreneurial. So if they give them the opportunity, they will create amazing companies, whether Tencent or Alibaba and Ant and ByteDance, you name it, right?
The heads of older economy, industrial conglomerates dominated China's rich list in 2005, and yet none of these would even crack the top 400 richest globally. But signs of the impending internet boom were there, with 2 names in the top 10 hailing from technology companies. Fortunes, though, were about to change dramatically. Today, Jack Ma's wealth alone is about double that of the 40 richest in 2005 combined, and Ma's not even the richest in China today. 6 of the top 10 wealthiest on the 2021 Bloomberg China billionaires list are tech tycoons, with at least $25 billion in wealth each.
It's not just 1 or 2. China has a generation of, I would say, world-class companies.
Such as the 3rd member of the so-called BAT, or Baidu, Alibaba, Tencent triumvirate of leading Chinese internet platforms.
I think companies like us, we invest more than 15% of our total revenue every year to do R&D. I think the government like that. And in the meanwhile, I think antitrust is also good for innovation. You just cannot imagine, the number 1 and number 2 guy all of a sudden merge and gaining more than 90% of market share in the US. But that happened quite a few times in China before. That's not good for innovation. So I think that the antitrust push is kind of justified.
One way the BAT biggies grew their girth was by pouring billions into many of China's next-generation tech unicorns, sometimes even cross-investing in the same startups. It obviously further inflated the big platforms' offerings, but arguments could be made on both sides whether the M&A closed off or cracked open competition.
When you zoom into one company and you say, well, gee, if the other guys are doing it, and if I don't do it, then I am in a competitive disadvantage. So I think some measure to at least make the ground rule clearer, and that would certainly be helpful to us. Us meaning VCs who invest into early stage technology companies, quite frankly, with a goal of using new technologies and new business model to possibly disrupt some of these big companies.
More competition might be helpful to the perception of Alibaba, and that's growing. We see that with Pinduoduo, we see it with JD, we also see it with these streaming sites. That if you have all this traffic on the TikToks of China, including Douyin and Kuaishou, that you actually see a real opportunity for these companies eventually to make a dent in e-commerce. It's not there yet, it's happening, but there is competition on the margin for Alibaba.
It's important to note, many of these investments by Alibaba and Tencent flew under the domestic antitrust radar because nearly all the Chinese companies listed outside of China are done through a VIE structure, or variable interest entity.
For a really long time, antitrust authority did not vet any cases involving a VIE structure for fear of granting it legitimacy.
Right.
Because these had always operated in the legal gray area.
Yeah.
Okay? And as a result of that, you see, the duopoly that you just mentioned, Alibaba and Tencent have made hundreds of acquisitions without making any notification to the antitrust authority. The authority is sending a signal and make it very clear that VIE cases will no longer be exempted. They are going to scrutinize those deals. Although, some may say this might be a little bit too late.
I think the biggest challenge now for the companies that, on one hand, their business model and their practice were developed under the older regulatory regime, which is what was more relaxed. Now they're under closer scrutiny, but there is basically no precedent.
Already, under the new regulatory framework, China's antitrust watchdog has fined Alibaba, Tencent, Didi Chuxing, and Baidu for past acquisitions and investments that were not properly disclosed.
It doesn't mean that we had monopoly practices. The fine was not for that. And I also think it's not right for the government to block every deal, right? Certain kind of liquidity is also good for innovation. You just cannot do monopoly things.
The main query here is, has this firm done anything wrong? Has it trying to exclude competitors? Has it trying to charge consumers super competitive prices? All over the world, I mean, antitrust regulators have shared similar concern about big tech. But high market share does not necessarily mean this firm is a monopoly.
Their job is to break up monopolies, right?
Bad monopolies.
There's a difference.
Yes.
Monopoly everywhere, if it hinders competition, is bad. Right? So it deserves public attention. It deserves government regulators to take necessary actions to deal with that.
Has it hindered competition?
Of course, there's a legitimate question as regards the possibility those platforms might abuse their market power. Okay, and the tech companies, Alibaba, Tencent, and others, also, as they get bigger and successful, they have responsibility to behave themselves.
Coming up, how does this cloud of uncertainty change how and where a company like Alibaba chooses to grow, such as in the cloud itself?
At the beginning, nobody cared about data. Later, everybody take care together. Just like last century, at the beginning, nobody take care of the oils. And now later, everybody love the oil. For the oil, they would love to have the wars.
When you go ahead of the regulators, always there's a painful thing. Because they say, hey, wait a minute. My job is to regulate. My job is not about innovation. My job is not to improve the other people's life. That's your job. It's the painful processing that Alibaba is learning.
How have you stayed close to the fire, though, without being burned?
We are very careful. When we're young, it's okay. Now we're big. We probably regulate ourselves much more stricter, much more than the regulators.
Welcome back to this Bloomberg Television special, Red Lines, China and Big Tech. I'm Stephen Engel. Clearly, it's been a delicate high-wire act for the outspoken Jack Ma to stay in the Chinese government's good graces. But when the Ant IPO was suddenly scuppered at the last minute, Jack Ma, the eternal showman, did a disappearing act.
Where is Jack Ma? The Chinese billionaire hasn't been seen in months.
The $600 billion question, where is Jack Ma?
I think when we hear, China billionaire and then the word missing, which was, I think wrong, but I mean, basically, we're used to the script. You've seen other high-profile business leaders fall afoul politically of the government. But so there's a tendency to think it's all going to be in the same bucket. I don't think so.
每年腊八节是我们约定的日子。
Jack has been very, very good at managing relationship with the government. He once famously said that I'm not marrying the government, I'm dating with the government. He knows how to manage the relationship with the government very well. And I think his remark kind of indicates, his business is quite vulnerable to regulatory attack.
There's a real danger here that in prosecuting an agenda of long-term domestic political control and greater centralization, that in fact you begin to snuff out private sector business confidence.
Our biggest concern is knee-jerk reactions to certain events. So if certain giant fintech companies listing getting pulled suddenly translate into a whole bunch of other events, such as Starboard listing suddenly slows down across the board. And these kind of things do happen in China. And that's the part that really, really irritates practitioners on the ground.
China's securities regulator reportedly may indeed tighten rules for listing on China's Nasdaq-like star market, with added scrutiny on fintech.
I believe, better oversight does not necessarily choke off growth, unless it's dumb, stupid regulation, right? Which I don't think that's the case, because I think Chinese regulators are very, very smart, and in fact, market-friendly.
From an investment standpoint, how does this cloud, or how does it change how you might make an investment in tech now?
Our investment approach hasn't changed. We continue to think, technology can be force for good.
At the end of the day, is the Chinese big tech surge going to be limited because of this?
I don't think so. I think they might even have the potential to grow even bigger and stronger. Because from the government standpoint, it's not in their interest to see their tech companies to become smaller and weaker.
So what leverage does Jack Ma and Pony Ma have?
The leverage lies in their cash rich. They have strong talent pool. They are already very sophisticated in software development.
They have the data.
Yeah.
Which the government probably wants as well.
I wouldn't disagree with that.
A year and a half ago, China released a document codifying data as one of the core socialist factors of production, under the idea that you must have a well-regulated data market in order to maintain economic growth. This is the fundamental core operating principle that China will be using to regulate big tech over the next 10 years, and it's something that really hasn't yet entered into the Western lexicon.
The Chinese government is said to be mulling a state-backed joint venture with the large platforms to oversee how their combined data is managed and shared.
Anti-monopoly alone wouldn't solve the problem. Rather, there should be an agency in China which serves as a champion for the internet sector. In other words, not try to crack down the problems, try to develop the sector.
But pooling data raises a host of privacy issues. Tencent's Pony Ma, in a March analyst call, conceded that data is extremely complicated. There's a fine line, he says, between ensuring users' privacy and opening up data to sharing. Others, like Baidu, claim to be open to opening their data vaults.
It's very much in line with our belief. We run a lot of open platforms. For autonomous driving, it's Apollo, right? For AI in general, we have Baidu Brain, which is also open. We like openness. We want to share data with other partners.
Giving up one's data surely could upend existing market-leading positions, but non-compliance is perhaps the bigger risk. For Alibaba, getting off with a fine doesn't mean it's in the clear, and that alone surely won't pave the way for an ant-IPO resurrection.
It depends on how the government restructure our regulatory framework in terms of financial technology, and also depends on how the company reacts to the changing regulatory environment.
Which begs the question, how far will the government go in taking on Alibaba and Tencent and all the others?
Of course, they need the golden eggs laid by these geese, right? They need the innovation, the growth. And they know that if they try and do this all from a state company, it's not going to work.
I'm hopeful. I think as long as the policies and regulations are applied fairly across the board, then I think positive results will come about. Now, if these regulations and policies are applied unevenly, and especially unevenly with certain political agenda behind it, then it could be a different story.
This is a story that has many more chapters to be written, not only in China, but anywhere where governments may feel that big tech has crossed the line. For Bloomberg Television, I'm Stephen Engel. Thanks for watching.